All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Kyra, do you wanna kick us off this morning?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by giving a sincere land acknowledgement and thanking Stephanie for her land acknowledgement, which was very informative for all of us. And so I'm calling today from the traditional territory of Songhees First Nation, who, as part of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples and along with the Sinchothan peoples, are the traditional caretakers of the land that you have likely heard referred to as Victoria. We also hold our hands up to the Tsartlip First Nation, who host our head office in their community and are the custodians of the land on which we live, work, learn, and play. And Bridget today is calling in from the traditional and unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We both would like to acknowledge that we are grateful, uninvited guests on these territories, and that we've had an immense privilege to be able to learn from the communities who we serve and on whose land we've been mostly born and raised. So Gitksan-speaking to everyone who is on the call today and to the caretakers of the land from where you're calling in as well. Kyra Tanesne, Chislea Sinlea et Metulia, Unilesin Eisha Lea et Tsuri, Hokunes Chislea et Irish, Chase Sinlea et First Peoples Cultural Council, Kunangas in Quintola the Language Technology Program, Kunangas in Quintola the Heliset Tlasqual, Sol Nisquela Equines Etla Tia Enoch. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyra Borland. I'm currently living in Victoria. I was born and mostly raised in Surrey, BC on Semiahmoo territory, but my ancestry is Irish. I am non-Indigenous. I work at First Peoples Cultural Council. I've been here about 3.5 years. I'm currently the Language Technology Program Coordinator, although it's possible we've interacted in the past when my role was FirstVoices Coordinator and Trainer, and I currently oversee both FirstVoices and Digitization. I am really grateful to be able to do the work that I do, and I'm grateful to be able to speak with you all here today. And I'm really looking forward to the learning that we're about to embark on together. Over to Bridget for your introduction.
Yeah. So hi, everyone. My name is Bridget Chase. I am also a very grateful non-Indigenous employee at the First Peoples Cultural Council. My role there is the FirstVoices Technology Coordinator, and I feel very privileged to act as a sort of liaison between the amazing community language teams that are working on the FirstVoices platform and using it to document and support their language revitalization projects across the province. And I work to liaise between those teams and our phenomenal development team who works on the platform itself, supporting with language technology. I am also of Irish and Scottish ancestry and feel very privileged to be living here in beautiful Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, which is currently called Vancouver. It's actually a beautiful day here, unlike usual, so I'm feeling feeling like it's a bit of a lucky charm that the sunshine is out. And really, really grateful for all of you to have shown up today and to be here to learn with us, talking about Indigenous names and alphabets in the context of technology.
It's good to see you all here today.
Yeah, so you'll hear throughout the presentation, Kyra will be speaking a little bit of Sinchothan, which is exciting for all of us to hear. And other than Kyra's amazing Sinchothan, our kind of outline today that we're going to be going through is starting off with a very brief introduction on what is the First Peoples Cultural Council, to give you all a little bit of context on who we are and what we do at our organization. And then we're going to walk through the what, whys, and hows when it comes to Indigenous naming practices, Indigenous writing systems, and the technology that exists and can be used to support these things. We will finish off the presentation component with next steps, talking about some practical, tangible tips and tricks that you can take back to your teams and discuss to figure out kind of your next steps internally. And then after that presentation, we'll be taking a 15-minute break, and we really want this to be time for you to take a breather, absorb the information that we discussed, and have a chance to prepare any questions or discussion points you may have. If you are here today with team members, whether they be virtually in this room or physically in the same room as you, this would also be a good chance to touch base with them, have a quick discussion, and see, you know, if there's any questions that you can come up with as a group. We really want that 60-minute question period to be as full and sort of well-rounded as possible, so that everyone can leave here feeling, you know, fully satisfied with the knowledge that they take away from the presentation. Of course, if you have clarification questions as we go through the presentation, we totally encourage you to ask them, you know, as they come up. If you have more discussion questions or questions about next steps, or perhaps sort of larger overarching questions related to the extended implications of any of the information we present today, we would just ask that you hold those until the discussion period. We've got an hour blocked off, so don't worry, there's lots of time to get through everyone's questions. And with all of that in mind, I'm going to let Kyra take it away and talk a little bit about the First Peoples Cultural Council.
Yeah, so some of you might be familiar with us and our work. Some of you might be thinking, I didn't even know that existed. So we just want to level the playing field and give everybody an equal understanding of who we are and where we're coming from in this work. So First Nation, wow, starting right off by saying our name wrong. That's great. First Peoples Cultural Council is not a ministry, but rather we are a First Nations directed Crown corporation. We have a board of directors and community members from across the province who oversee our activities and policies. And if you'd like more information about the establishment of our organization or our exact mandate, we'd encourage you to refer to the First Peoples Heritage, Language, and Culture Act. So what do we do as this First Nations directed Crown Corporation? FPCC is unique in Canada and in the world. Other organizations similar to us exist, but our unique 31-year history and the diversity of programming that we engage in across different domains of First Nations culture has us uniquely positioned to provide insight into certain topics such as writing systems, which is why we're here today. We are the delivery agent for funding for arts, language, and heritage, which comes from several sources, including provincial and federal government and foundations in Canada and the United States. We participate heavily in advocacy by engaging in dialogue through meetings and presentations and publications on various topics, which is, again, why we are here today, is engaging in that advocacy part of our work. Who do we serve? This is a question that comes up often. Who qualifies to take part in our programming? We serve BC First Nations communities and individuals. So at the moment, all of our work is provincially contained. There are 204 BC First Nations with 34 languages and over 90 varieties of those languages. As such, there are 35 to 40 distinct writing systems actively in use in the province with corresponding keyboards. And we'll talk more about what that means later on. We don't at this time deliver language funding for languages originally from outside of BC, which includes Métis and Inuit languages. So although we do host some keyboard software for languages from outside of BC, our language program funding is provincially contained. We engage heavily in a community development approach, which is one of our guiding principles. Our funding delivery process includes thorough training and skill building to support successful community-led project outcomes, and we invest in capacity development and knowledge preservation. We're also passionate about fair representation and capacity building in the grant application and adjudication process itself to build capacity in communities around proposal writing. Through this process, we're often connected with other organizations and ministries such as yourselves, which brings us back to our knowledge sharing and advocacy work. Bridget, you're on mute.
Wow, after 2 years of being on Teams and Zoom, you'd think I'd be better at that, hey? So as I mentioned briefly in our outline, we've developed a bit of a presentation roadmap for you that we hope will guide us through the different topics today that all kind of link together to support the broader topic of Indigenous alphabets and writing systems in technology. So what we're going to start off with today is talking about the what. So what are Indigenous naming practices? And first off, Kyra.
Yes, and Sheestingasen. I'm going on a trip. Let's go on a trip together.
Yeah. So talking about Indigenous naming practices, it's important to note that naming customs within communities in BC are highly varied due to the amazing density and rich diversity of cultural practices here contained within what we currently call British Columbia. You know, what we're going to talk about today are some of the sort of myths and facts that are important to note about Indigenous naming customs and practices here. It's by no means sort of an end-all be-all list, but it's a good basic start for everyone to get a solid understanding of how naming practices can work in different communities across BC. It is important to note that thorough and widespread research on this topic has not yet been conducted. And so what we are presenting for you today is kind of within the scope of our own understanding of experience and with the communities we've worked with. But it's really important to keep in mind as we walk through this, just that the kind of priority is just to be prepared for the need to adapt to a variety of cultural naming requirements. And just because the research hasn't necessarily been compiled to a larger extent, does not mean that there are not immediate and tangible things that you can do to accommodate existing naming practices in BC. This is really an opportunity to practice innovation and inclusivity when it comes to celebrating Indigenous names and naming practices. So with that being said, we'll get started with our first myth fact. So the first myth and fact is that all people had a first and last name. Depending on where you're from, this may be a common, if not practical thing that occurs, and that you have a first name and you have a last name. But the fact is that the practice of mononyms is present in Indigenous communities in BC. It's quite common in Salish naming practices, and you may have seen elders, Indigenous elders, referenced with a single traditional name and then perhaps an English first and last name in brackets afterwards. Traditional names are often passed down via family lineage, which negates the need for a surname since the family who the name comes from is inherent in the history of the name. I'd like to remind everyone as well, just that if you have questions about any of the things we're talking about as they come up, please feel free to put them in the chat or to use the raise your hand function. But with that, I'll pass it on to the next myth.
So the next myth may be an easier one to think about, as you likely have encountered this, but the myth is that there's a defined maximum length for names, and this could go for minimum length as well. The fact here is that names can be long and character limits may impede accurate name recording. I know that I myself have encountered this. My full legal name, I have a double-barreled first name with no hyphens hyphen, a middle name, and a double-barreled last name with a hyphen. And it has been a problem when I travel internationally that my name on my ticket never matches my name on my passport, because it often cannot be physically printed on the ticket. And I have stood in many an airport lineup to try to deal with that fact.
So our next myth is that people's names are assigned at birth. This is very common in North American or Western European standards, but the fact is that there are Indigenous communities in BC who traditionally practice delayed naming well into childhood. So as an example, in traditional Gitxsan naming practices, children actually aren't given their lifetime name until puberty.
Yeah, the next myth is that people's names do not change, or that they change only at certain times, like marriage. The reality in BC is that it's a common practice in Indigenous communities for names to be changed or even expanded upon at the time of significant life events or achievements through ceremony. We work closely with an elder whose English name is John Elliott, but who later in life was given the name Stolquist through ceremony and significant family inheritance. And then when he received an honorary PhD and another ceremony was held at the same time, his name was changed again to Gitksan. And so this practice marks his legacy at the time of name changes and uses ceremony to hand down family names at significant times. And so it's important for us to know that name changes do happen and may not happen in the way that we expect.
So our next myth here is that names always start with a capital letter and contain lowercase letters after it. So using my name as an example, my name starts with a capital B, and then the rest of the letters are all lowercase. But the reality is that this isn't necessarily always the case. There are Indigenous communities in BC whose writing systems only use uppercase letters or only use lowercase letters. For example, Senchothin, the language that Kyra is speaking kind of throughout the presentation, is an alphabet that uses all capital letters. There are no lowercase letters. And other alphabets, like Inkleketmechchin, use only lowercase letters. There are no uppercase letters at all. And so because of this, names might not be in what we would consider the standard format of uppercase to lowercase.
The next myth is that people's names do not contain what we think of as numbers. In reality, numerical symbols are used by some Indigenous writing systems to represent sounds that aren't captured by the Roman alphabet. One word that you might have heard is Squatmish, or the language Squatmish Snitchem. It's an example of an Indigenous community and language in BC whose name employs the numerical number 7 to represent a sound that isn't captured by the Roman alphabet. It's that sort of glottal stop or throat catch sound before the M sound in Squatmish. It's that sound. We'll talk about this more later on and why the 7 might have been introduced to represent this sound, but that's what's happening there, is that the 7 simply represents a sound that isn't captured by the Roman alphabet.
And our last myth for you here is that all names can be written in quote-unquote English. So it's a common myth, thought process that, well, hey, you know, if you have a name, maybe it uses some of these special characters, it can be sort of anglicized and translated into the English alphabet or the Roman alphabet. But the reality is, the fact is that when we anglicize Indigenous writing systems, we actually lose the sounds that are intended to be conveyed, and thus we lose the meaning and the history of the name. And so it's really important that we don't default to just thinking, you know, well, we can anglicize this name, and we actually fully respect the integrity of the original alphabet that the name is meant to be written in and the language that the name comes from. And so with that, we've gotten through step 1 already. I want to just take a quick pause for a second here and check in, see if there's any questions that have arisen, either in the chat or by raising a hand before we move down our roadmap into step 2, the why section.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm sorry to not raise my hand, but I was battling to find the button.
That's okay.
The question is why was it the choice of a number to represent a phonetic rather than using one of the phonetic characters in the Unicode set?
We're going to get into that later on.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I think we're going to get into that in this next section. So you're giving us a nice segue. Thank you, Bruce. Connie's asking, is this presentation recording going to be available after? Yes, it is. And I see a hand from Carrie.
Hi there. You mentioned that some communities give the names to them during puberty or later in life or a significant time. Do you know, can you tell us the significance as to why that is? I'm sure for each different nation or Indigenous community and language grouping, it would be different, but can you give a general sense as to some of the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, it's incredibly varied. As you rightly pointed out, it's a diverse practice. And in my experience, I did most of my studies with the Gitxsan community in my academic career, and I'll hold up my hands to them for this knowledge. Even different families have different understandings or accepted explanations for why the practice is the way that it is. And so I don't think it would be appropriate for me to speculate, but this is an example of, early in the presentation we said, this research into naming practices and their diversity in BC, it hasn't been centrally compiled, and that's likely because it hasn't actually been invested in. So if this is something that is important to your department and your work, this is an opportunity to advocate for investment in community-led research.
Thank you so much. Great answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Okay. If there are no other kind of pressing questions, then we can move into the why. So why are Indigenous writing systems important?
What is your name? So let's talk about why we're advocating for Indigenous writing systems today. And thank you, Bridget, for bringing us to this part of the presentation. So there are some official and or legislative reasons why, before we get into the other reasons. Firstly, the TRC report and the calls to action. Call to action 17 reads, in part, we call upon all levels of government to enable residential school survivors and their families to reclaim names changed by the residential school system, including the revision of official identity documents. And this revision cannot be done accurately, and reclamation cannot be done for many people in completeness without the ability to use in its entirety the writing system that is used to record that name in the community today. Legislatively, as you all likely know, DRIPA is the provincial implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And Article 13 reads, in part, that Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. So that self-determination of designation and retention of names is not complete for many without the implementation of those writing systems at all levels of government. And the declaration, or the article also states that states shall take effective measures to ensure that this right is protected. And so hopefully we're taking a small step towards that today. Outside of legislation, you'll likely have seen in recent media coverage where Indigenous people have pointed out the inability to reclaim language and tradition when barred from writing their language in official documentation of names of businesses and individuals. And many have spoken out about how not being able to access documents reflecting their writing system is a form of discrimination or oppression. We therefore need to invest time and manpower into solutions for these scenarios. So while we're aware that if not laborious for you, this task will at the very least be radical in your work, we believe in the importance of providing access to language and naming reclamation in this way. We have one last myth and fact for you that we think is important to talk about. It's often said that Indigenous languages were never written down or didn't have a way of writing at all before colonization. In fact, while oral history was a common way of passing down knowledge, there is also evidence of other ways of recording knowledge. Such as weaving, which was used often as a form of trade ledger and counting, and then also petroglyphs, which we know have significant historical and cultural importance to the communities where they're found. The conclusion I'd like us to draw from this myth and fact, even though it might seem tenuously related to what I've just been talking about, is that it can be our habit to dismiss new information based on things that we've been taught by society and potentially, our classes in school, and that we therefore come to believe are true. However, this may lead us to miss the bigger picture and to neglect to honor the tradition of the people who have long been the caretakers of the land that we're working on. We're in the unique position today, all of us, to be able to create change that has a profound and lasting impact on the ability of Indigenous peoples to reclaim their names through official government channels, should they choose to do so. And so it's our responsibility and our burden to make that choice available. The next slide is going to take us a bit into Bruce's question from earlier. So let's talk about symbols in Indigenous writing systems and where they come from. Symbols in any writing system, or combinations of those symbols, have correlations to sound in the language that they're being used to describe, such as a K, meaning the sound K in English, or C plus H, meaning the sound ch in English. There are, however, hundreds of possible sounds that you can make with your vocal apparatus, your human speech channel, and all languages use only a subset of those sounds that a human can possibly make. So, the languages of early visitors to Turtle Island did not have all of the same sounds as the languages of the Indigenous peoples here, such as that throat catch sound that we were talking about earlier, that There were many efforts made to adapt existing settler writing systems to capture the sounds of Indigenous languages, like using the Roman numeral 7 to represent that sound. And in early days, the reason why this was not written using the IPA or the International Phonetic Alphabet like Bruce was talking about was because one, the IPA actually hadn't been brought over here yet. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And two, typewriter limitations. So while what you're looking at on the screen here in the picture on the right is an example of an early IPA-based typewriter, most folks who were working here and trying to record language only had access to your standard Roman alphabet typing contraption, which also did typically have, pardon me, also did typically have those Arabic numerals that we use in our writing systems included as well, such as the 7. So while this is one situation in which the 7 turned out to be a good solution for the community in terms of capturing the sound that was missing. There were many instances in which this was very much a situation of trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, where the writing system didn't actually perfectly capture all of the sounds that were being spoken by the elders who were fluent in their language. Therefore, community-led decision-making about writing systems in present day is incredibly important for reconciliation in our modern context. So how is this happening? Actually, let me back up. I do want to talk about that colonial history a little bit. So early efforts to write down writing systems were made by first missionaries, and then later on by anthropologists, and anthropology developed into the study of linguistics. And then often those imposed writing systems were at times introduced by explicit government requirements for documentation of persons. There have been changes over time, and changes that are ongoing nowadays via language authorities or other community groups. You may hear the term language authority come up, so we'll explain it a little bit, but be aware that not every community has a language authority. These are established bodies within communities who engage in traditional protocol and consultation concerning language revitalization, and this includes making necessary revisions or developments concerning writing systems that support revitalization and reclamation from a community-based perspective. This is often because of what we've been describing, where the writing system doesn't actually perfectly work to describe the language that it is attempting to describe. But it may also be for the purpose of differentiation and independence, where communities may have been lumped together inappropriately by linguists as using the same writing system. So let's talk a little bit more now about what systems exist. This list is not exhaustive, but it's meant to be illustrative of the types of systems you're likely to encounter, and it's based on our own observations. And so there's definitely some researcher bias there. This is our own perspective on the types of systems that you're likely to encounter. And so take it with a grain of salt. Do not take our word as gospel here. But these are our observations through the work that we do. So firstly, let's talk about the Roman-based writing systems. These were early introductions by missionaries, later adapted by linguists and anthropologists. And as I explained earlier, were often adapted to the language that they were being used to describe as a means of typewriter convenience. Their usage is quite common across the province, often with added diacritics or with other symbols being used unexpectedly, like we've been talking about in Squamish-Snitcham. So important to note here that the diacritics being used don't originate from the IPA, and they use Roman numerals, or Arabic numerals rather, in this rather unexpected way. The next writing system we'll talk about is the IPA, or the International Phonetic Alphabet, and I'm going to take a moment to really delve into that one. It's sometimes identified as a one-size-fits-all solution to capturing the sounds of Indigenous languages. And that's because this writing system was developed by French anthropologists and linguists who were seeking to study the languages of the world for predominantly European academic purposes. This writing system was not designed to serve communities, but rather it was designed to solve problems encountered by academics who were studying communities for academic benefit, as opposed to community benefit. The IPA is a huge and yet not perfectly exhaustive set of symbols that are intended to match to every single possible sound that can be made with the human speech apparatus, this thing here. Due to its size, the IPA is very cumbersome to learn. The idea of using the IPA as a unilateral solution for recording Indigenous languages also contributes to the erasure of community and linguistic identity, and contributes to the myth that Indigenous cultures are hegemonic. when we know that they're incredibly diverse. And identity is very important to communities who are engaging in that reclamation practice. So in sum, the IPA is not universally accepted by Indigenous communities because of its origins as a white academic tool. It's difficult to learn and use in many contexts, and it is sometimes thought to be contributive to the erasure of linguistic identity. So for these reasons, it's not sufficient to use the IPA as a single solution to recording Indigenous languages. However, I don't want you to believe, the conclusion that I don't want you to draw is all Indigenous communities hate the IPA. That's not true. It's just not a one-size-fits-all solution. So this was brought over by early anthropologists and linguists of French origin, and its usage is somewhat common, but it is fading a little. There are, however, some writing systems in the province that are in, decided, consistent usage that are based largely on the IPA. New Channels, for example, is a language that uses a primarily IPA-derived writing system and also uses lowercase exclusively. So despite, the origins of the writing system, the community is very comfortable with this practice and chooses to use it. There are other communities who have previously had IPA-based systems who have chose to shed those systems in favor of community-developed or community-revised approaches. So it's important to recognize the diversity of practice and the diversity of comfort with those writing systems. Next, I'll talk a little bit about syllabic writing systems. So you've likely noticed these ones because for those of us who are unfamiliar with them, they're kind of fun to look at, honestly. I think they're very beautiful the way they look. These were developed by missionary linguists, and they're uncommon, but they're decidedly present. So syllabic means here that one symbol represents a syllable, so a combination of a few different sounds, rather than one symbol representing one sound. And they use these shapes that were novel at the time of their introduction to represent those sounds. And one example of this is Neyawewen or Plains Cree, which does use this syllabic writing system. And you may have also seen Dakesh, which is a language from up north in BC that also uses syllabics. And you'll notice here in the example that alternative Roman spelling does exist, but it's incredibly important to realize that it may not be preferred just because it exists. And so true reclamation needs to include the ability for folks to use syllabics. Lastly, we'll talk about novel spelling systems, of which there is one in BC. This was developed by the Sinchothan community with some linguistic aid in its refining, but it is a community-led initiative. So this is an uncommon approach, but it is decidedly present as the community is very passionate about it. And in those communities, it is in pretty determined use, and it is even in use in immersion schools. So entire generations of children are learning to spell using the novel Sinchothan writing system. What is novel about it is that it uses certain diacritics that didn't exist previously, such as the slash through the letter, which you'll see as we go through our Sinchothan examples, and it also uses all uppercase letters. I saw a question come in the chat about are syllabics common in Inuit writing practices? Yes, they are present in Inuit writing practices as well. But as we focus on languages present in BC, that's why I used the Cree and Dakesh examples. So that brings me to the end of this section, and I will pass the talking stick off to Bridget.
Thanks. Yeah, so again, we've kind of reached the next bend of our presentation roadmap. So I do just want to take a moment and open up the floor for any questions that may have come up during that last bend, the why. Any questions about writing systems, why they're important, how they work, all of the fantastic information from Kyra. You can put it in the chat, you can click the raise your hand button, or you can just unmute. Okay. If something does come up, feel free to pop it in the chat, but it seems like people are still ready to keep going, so I will keep going. So we're into step 3 now, which is how. We've learned, we know what are Indigenous naming practices. We've talked about Indigenous writing systems and why they're important, and now you have some context there. And so now we're gonna talk about technology, and we're going to discuss how we can support Indigenous names and writing systems using technology.
This one is harder for me to say, so I appreciate your patience. Now, you finally managed to write my name down. What a good feeling that would be, hey?
Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about how did you do just that, using technology. And we're going to start by talking about Unicode. So some of you may have heard of Unicode. Some of you, this might be brand new to you. So I'm going to give sort of a basic introduction on what this is. Unicode is the encoding system that displays characters in any language on all digital devices and spaces. Unicode has been around since the 80s, so this is a piece of technology that is not new by any means and is a standard across devices. So whether you're on a Mac or a PC or an iPhone or an Android or some sort of tablet, a Chromebook, and whether you're on the internet or you're using Microsoft Word or you're sending a text message, Unicode is the encoding sort of standard nowadays. And the way that it works is that every single character has its own unique code point that allows the device to read it and then display the correct character. And this actually includes emoji, fun fact. And this is why if you're on an iPhone and you send somebody a little smiley face emoji, even if they're on an Android, that smiley face is still going to show up because the phone is using these code points to determine what characters it is accurately representing. So for example, small letter A in our alphabet, we're used to seeing this letter, and it has its own code point, U0061. And this is what it makes it distinguished from all the other characters. Similarly, it's not just English letters that have code points, it's every letter. So small letter lambda with a stroke through it, the middle one there has its own code point, U019B. And as I said, emojis also have code points, so U1F60D is the code point for the lovely smiling face with the heart-shaped eyes. So Unicode is the system itself. And then UTF-8, or Unicode Transformation Format 8-bit, is the most widely used format to represent Unicode text. And so for all of the techies in the room, you may be interested to know that UTF-8 can encode all valid character code points in Unicode using 1 to 4 1-bit code units. If that means nothing to you, don't worry, not a big deal. But what is a big deal is knowing that there are currently 143,859 characters that are currently represented by Unicode for scripts and alphabets from around the world. Unicode is constantly evolving to meet the needs of changing language, and the Unicode Consortium, the group of folks that kind of manage Unicode as a system, every year they add new characters for alphabets around the world that were not previously represented by Unicode. So an example of this, if you remember from a few slides ago, Kyra talking about Senchothin and those novel characters. So for example, the T with the line through it, or if you've seen the C with the slash that goes across it, those initially weren't characters that were a part of Unicode because they were developed by the community. They were novel. But in 2004, a proposal was sent to Unicode by the Senchothin community with a request to add those novel characters into the Unicode sort of representation. and they were added. And so now those characters can be accurately typed and represented on any device using Unicode. Of course, today we're talking about primarily Indigenous languages here in British Columbia. But again, it's important to note that with those 140,000+ characters, languages all over the world globally are represented. So everything from hiragana in Japan has its own code point, and even Egyptian hieroglyphics have their own code point. So if any of you know how to speak in Egyptian hieroglyphics, you can type that up on your computer and send it off, and it will be rendered accurately across all systems. Connie asks, is Unicode available on DOS systems? That is a great question, Connie. I am not sure in this present moment, but I'm fairly certain that Unicode is the industry standard, and so I'd be happy to look that up for you after.
I can answer that.
Bruce, yeah.
DOS is typically still ASCII.
Great, thanks, Bruce. So continuing on in our discussion here for Indigenous languages, as we discussed, many characters in Indigenous languages have one or more diacritics. So diacritics are marks that are placed above, below, or beside a letter in a word, and usually these are added to indicate either a particular pronunciation, so accent, tone, stress, or used to indicate meaning. And so diacritics each have their own Unicode code point as well. And so as an example, the little comma there on the bottom left, that's actually a combining comma above. So that sits on top of letters, and it has its own code point. The middle one is combining macron below. It looks like a little underline. It sits underneath letters, and that has its own code point. And then you've got the modifier letter small w, and that is like a little superscript W, sits kind of to the top beside a code point, and beside a character, pardon me, and it has its own code point as well. This is obviously by no means the full kind of range of diacritics that exist in Indigenous languages here, but diacritics all do have their own code points. And so the way that it works to create these characters in Indigenous languages is sometimes it's necessary to combine code points together, code points for letters with code points for diacritics, and then that kind of creates the full character that you see displayed on your screen. So for example, the small letter K with a combining comma above, and that kind of K with the little comma on top, that's a very common letter in Indigenous alphabets. And the way that it is kind of created on the computer or on your device is by slapping together the small letter K code point with that combining comma above code point, and woohoo, now K with the combining comma above exists. Now you may be thinking, oh my gosh, well, how am I going to learn how to type all these code points to create these letters? Don't worry, that's not how it works. You don't need to, by any means, memorize or know these code points. This is just how the computer or your digital device knows it. How you are able to type these is by using keyboards. So before I move into keyboards, I just want to pause here because I know for some folks this might be a brand new topic, Unicode. I'm trying to give a very brief sort of overview of it, but if anyone has any questions or clarification points, I'd be happy to clear that up now before we talk about keyboards. Steve has a question in the chat about Indigenous language revitalization. That's a really great question, Steve. I'm just going to save that one to the question period because it's definitely a bigger point of discussion. But thank you for that. That's a good one to kick us off. Does anyone have questions about Unicode before we keep going? Okay, so keyboards. This is how we are able to type characters properly, is by using keyboards. Now, when we think about keyboards, a lot of us may think about this thing here, right? A physical keyboard that you have either attached to your computer or maybe it's separate. It's got all these buttons. You press the buttons and boom, you can type on your computer. But what I'm actually talking about today is keyboard software. So keyboard software is software that reconfigures this physical keyboard to be able to type in another language. And so the way it works is on your keyboard right now, let's imagine, you've got all your buttons and you've got the button that says 9. Well, when you press 9, whether you're on, in a Word document or you're on Twitter or you're, on your phone in a text message, when you hit that button that says 9, your computer types the number 9. But when you download a piece of keyboard software for another language, an Indigenous language as an example, that keyboard software tells your device to reprogram these keys to output something different than what's written on them. So as an example, if I download the Gitksan-speaking keyboard and I press the button that says 9, my device is going to know to type this barred lambda with a glottal character because the software has told it, hey, this character corresponds to this button. And this is sort of the easiest way for you to easily type into whether it be a document, whether it be a database, whether it be somewhere online. This is the easiest way for you to type sort of Indigenous language characters with ease. And actually, it's so easy that I'm going to pass it off to Kyra really quickly to give you an example of how it looks to switch back and forth between your standard keyboard that you can type in English and an Indigenous language keyboard.
So you can see I've got a blank Word document here. I'm on Windows, and so how I toggle between keyboards that I have installed is to hold down the Windows button and to use the space bar to navigate between them. There is a hotkey equivalent on Mac, but I can't remember what it is right now. So I hold down the Windows and I'm going to navigate to Gitksan-speaking, which we've been talking about. If I want to type the word Gitksan-speaking, I go N9, and you see as why don't I zoom in here, as I've hit the 9, I've got that symbol. There, I've written Gitksan-speaking, and I can then just toggle down to my Sinchothan. And there I've written Sinchothan, some other Sinchothan characters you'll likely see. They're quite easy to type out, and you can see I can just toggle right back to English.
Amazing. Thanks, Kyra, for the quick demo. Getting some applause, some shocked faces in the chat. It's great. It's always exciting for people to see how easy it is really to toggle back and forth and to gain access to the ability to type in different Indigenous languages. So now you may be thinking, okay, great, keyboards. I guess I need keyboards. Where do I get these keyboards? Well, luckily, they are free and open source and available through a keyboard software called Keyman. The FPCC and the FirstVoices team over the years has developed keyboards for Indigenous languages in BC, as well as across Canada and globally abroad for Indigenous languages in other places around the world using the keyboard software Keyman. There's actually, I believe, 92 at this point FirstVoices keyboards available for languages all around the world. We use Keyman, to be clear, because it is free, it's accessible, it's open source, and it's compatible with all major devices except at this current time Chromebooks. And so whether you're on a Mac, a PC, some sort of Android mobile device, an iPhone, an iPad, all those good pieces of equipment, you are able to download Keyman and install and set up the keyboards that you need to be able to type in whatever Indigenous language you would like. So these links will be at the end and also will be sent out to everybody. But just if you have your phone on you for easy, quick access, we do have links to all of the FirstVoices keyboards. And so if you're looking for specifically FirstVoices Indigenous language keyboards, there's a list. We also have a list of all of the Keyman keyboards because, again, Keyman is a keyboard software that's used by people all around the world. So if you're interested in, finding a keyboard for maybe a heritage language that your family speaks, and you didn't know that this was the thing that existed, you can go on and check that out as well. It's kind of fun and interesting just to browse through and see all of the cool language keyboards that exist around the world. And then we also have keyboard instructions. So these are instructions, both video format and text, for how to download and install both the keyboard software and then the keyboards themselves onto your devices. And we have instructions for all different types of digital devices. Before I move into the next little topic here, does anyone have questions about keyboards? I see somebody asked, or Stephanie asked, do you go to firstvoices.com to download that software? And Kyra answered, a list of the links is forthcoming, so we will share those for sure. Are there any other questions about keyboards? How they work, how to use them, why we use them, anything that we need clarified before continuing on? You can put it in the chat, you can raise your hand, or you can unmute, I don't bite. Jeremy says, sounds like there is a market coming for key size stickers. Yeah, Jeremy, so actually funny enough, I have heard of at least one, maybe two communities that have developed a little almost like plasticky pad that you put over top of your keyboard that sits on top of the keys, and it has on that all of the little symbols that kind of correlate to their language keyboard, which is cool. And Walter has put a super interesting and useful piece of info in the chat. Walter says, at an operating level and keyboard perspective, the letters may be stored and read, but app level implications re checking for valid alphanumeric data in intake forms, database, display limitations, field length, like the airline ticket example, required fields for first, middle, last names are all things to seek guidance on to develop standards for new systems. That's really great, Walter. Thank you for that. We're going to talk at the end a little bit about some kind of first tangible next steps, and things that you've listed here are, is a great first next step. And we hope that during the Q&A and discussion period, if folks have ideas or pieces of information that they'd like to share that might be useful to other people, other departments, that's a great time to do that. So please feel free to put that kind of stuff in the chat, or also hold it for that discussion period as well. Okay, so if there's no questions about that, then I will keep on going. So the kind of last piece of technology that we have to talk about here is fonts. So fonts and keyboards are two things that are often kind of mixed into people's brains as one singular thing, but in reality, they're two very different things that are both important in their own unique way. And so a font is the style of characters on a screen or a page. So a font determines how the character looks, not what the character is. So the keyboard software, when you use a keyboard software and type, it's telling the device what the character is, what it should be. And a font is telling the device how the character should look. And so an example of this here on the slide is you can see G at the bottom. There's a G that's been typed, and put into the Calibri font. There's a G that's been put into the Tahoma font, and there's a G that's been put into the Times New Roman font. Now, all of these three letters are G. They're the same letter, and they all have the same code point, but they're just in different fonts, and those fonts are causing them to have a sort of different style or aesthetic to them, and that's what a font does. Now, because the internet is a extremely English-dominated space, most standard fonts that you see across, online and on your devices have been developed to specifically render English characters. When, the person who was designing the font was literally designing it out, they were doing it usually with English in mind, depending on, the font and where the font designer was from. And so because of this, some fonts won't display Indigenous language characters very well because they weren't designed with Indigenous language characters in mind. So you can see at the bottom of the slide here an example of an Indigenous language character that has 3 diacritics. It's got a little accent on top, and then a line, then the letter O, and then a hook at the bottom. And depending on the font, this letter can look quite a bit different. So in some of these examples, you can see the spacing is a little different. There's like some gaps between the diacritics. In some of them, the little accent on top is, more central, more to the left. In the Times font, it's just floating out in space. Why is it over there? I don't know. But you can see that this character is displayed in quite different ways when you use different fonts, even though it's technically the exact same character. And so the best font that we have found to display at least BC-based Indigenous characters is called BC Sans. And BC Sans was actually created by the provincial government, and we at First Voices helped to validate BC Sans, to test it and make sure that it accurately displayed and rendered Indigenous characters properly across different alphabets. And the nice thing about BC Sans is that it is also free, and it can be freely distributed and installed on any computer. And we, again, will have the link to install BC Sans in our list of links at the end. So that is sort of your basic technology stack that we can discuss in the how section. We've got Unicode, we've got keyboards, and we've got fonts. Before I move into sort of our next steps, our practical tips, is there any questions about fonts or keyboards or Unicode, anything that we've discussed in this how bit? Yes, Bruce, I see a hand. Bruce, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Thank you, Bridget.
No
I do that a lot. If people are not looking at the chat, I just wanted to draw attention to a really good comment by Walter. It speaks to questions that I have a lot of, and hopefully there'll be some lively discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Yes, and that's the comment that I was referring to earlier, Walter's fantastic comment about things to think about. Steve in the chat has asked, do text-to-speech tools exist for Indigenous languages? It's a great question, Steve. Text-to-speech tools are a relatively new piece of technology, and there are some Indigenous communities on a more global scale that have been working to develop the kind of text-to-speech tools, but it requires a lot of data and a lot of sort of background and tech to be able to get a functional text-to-speech tool working. So at this time, I don't personally know of any that exist for Indigenous languages here in BC, though I'm sure that there are Indigenous communities who are probably working on these sorts of things.
As our grant coordinator, I can say confidently that yes, there are several communities in the province who are currently working on speech-to-text technology.
Amazing. Isn't language technology fun? Okay, if there's no other questions, basic questions about fonts and keyboards and Unicode and all that good stuff, then we can move into the next steps. So, Garrett asked, are there areas of further development FPCC would like to see for BC Sans? It's a great question, Garrett. And off the top of my head, I don't have any particular answer to that, but I'm sure there are always opportunities for further development. So if you or someone is involved with BC Sans and has ideas, please reach out, because BC Sans is one of one of those things we always want to make sure is up to date and as kind of widespread as possible. Oh, and Kyra even said more widespread usage. That is totally one thing we'd like to see in terms of development for it. So yeah, in terms of next steps, we've sort of laid these out in terms of immediate next steps, and then more broad organizational next steps, and then personal next steps for your own personal learning and knowledge.
Yes, and Teichel Halas Goichel. It's good that you've arrived today, everyone, at this point in the presentation. Thank you for coming on this journey with us.
So as we move into this next steps, as just a really kind of broad overview reminder, what do I need again? Well, you need your systems to support Unicode, UTF-8. You need your systems to support fonts like BC Sans. You need to install keyboard software, for example, Keyman, onto your computers. And you need to install BC Sans onto your computers. And it is with these requirements set up that you will have the basis to be able to type Indigenous characters using your Unicode keyboard, and then have your system render that text properly using a font. Now, in terms of immediate next steps, you can go on to the First Peoples Maps. FPCC has a big maps project that if you haven't taken a look at, I would highly recommend everybody go and take a look at this. It's quite beautiful. And there is a language map, interactive language map at that link, maps.fpcc.ca. And you can use that to find the languages spoken in your region. And then you can use that information to find those keyboards. If you're looking for a good place to start, downloading and setting up the keyboards for the languages that are most commonly present in your region or territory is a great starting point. Another good kind of immediate next step or starting point is if you're looking at adapting your systems, whether it be in your department or your institution, your organization, you can check whether those systems are third-party or proprietary. And if they are third-party, you can see if they are used internationally, because if they are, then they most likely already can account for UTF-8. As you think back to earlier in this presentation, we talked about how Unicode is an encoding system that exists and works for languages all around the world. And so, you know, if you are using a piece of software or a system that's used in China, as an example, it's most likely that that system has been developed to accommodate alphabets in other languages, including alphabets in China. And you can also check what font your system currently uses internally, whether it be internal or externally in output, and you can check what needs to be done to add a custom font and change it. Garrett has added in the chat that BC Sans should now be available on government workstations. A push was made by device services. It's great. It's amazing. So yeah, that's also an immediate next step. Go see if your government workstation device has BC Sans installed, because if it doesn't, then apparently it should. So that's a pretty easy first next step. And then from there, once you have your Indigenous language keyboards set up on your device, you can actually just start to play around, test using real language data to see what renders and what doesn't, and then troubleshoot from there. We have a list of Indigenous alphabet characters used on FirstVoices that is available online and can be used as a basis for testing and confirmation. And all those links, again, will be shared out after the presentation. And so if you've got your keyboard installed, you can go on to FirstVoices, and there is an amazing set of language content and material on there that you can use to check and see, you know, what's rendering properly, what's not rendering properly, are things looking, you know, good, or things looking wonky on my systems. When it comes to organizational next steps, obviously every organization will be different, but some very sort of broad based advice. You can talk to your teams, your directors, your ADM, your staff about all of this. You know, we really appreciate everyone that's come to this presentation, but we also understand that there's probably far more people that can benefit from this knowledge. And now you are able to go back to your own teams and share it and have these sorts of discussions. Encourage your teams to get involved and consider how your organization could improve inclusivity in your processes, systems, and technologies. You can figure out what policies are in place in your workplace that are already there to enact changes, and figure out what possible policy changes need to be discussed. And then from there, you can come up with a plan to bring about these changes from structural, process, and technical perspectives. And again, this is where those comments in the chat from Walter talking about, the implications of different systems and technologies that you may be using. Those are things that you can discuss as a team and figure out a plan to bring about changes if needed. And for new projects, make sure that you always consider your immediate steps up front. And then last but not least, we have that sort of personal next steps, your personal learning and knowledge. We hope that everyone here today is feeling like they already know a lot more, perhaps than they did coming into it, but learning is never done for anyone. We're always learning ourselves about these sorts of topics. And so we've compiled a list of suggested readings that you can, sit down with a cup of coffee and perhaps give a read and expand your own knowledge bases. And these links include everything from the TRC calls to action, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, some of those articles that we referenced earlier on in the presentation about people, Indigenous folks requesting to change their names or registering business names, and then a variety of other articles related to everything from Indigenous history and residential school to Indigenous language technologies. We also have other suggested links online for not necessarily things you should read, but things you could go and check out. So we would highly recommend that everyone go and check out the FPCC website after this, as well as FirstVoices, which is our online digital language revitalization platform. We have a knowledge base at FirstVoices that provides a bunch of information, not only about FirstVoices and how to use it, but also about Indigenous languages and language technology in general. There are those maps, the First Peoples maps that I discussed earlier, all of the different keyboard links, and then the BC Sans font as well. Yeah.